Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrywka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. The notion of animal rights, meaning that we recognize their universal, intrinsic rights, regardless if some animals are more useful for humans or not, is being talked about more and more these days. However, we can't fully understand the lives of animals, and in result, we can't understand our own lives without microbes and our relationship with them. Our lives depend on them. In other words, we belong to them. This episode revolves around speculative microbial perspective in the work of Terike Haapoja. Terike is a visual artist based in New York whose work investigates animality, multispecies politics, cohabitation, repairing connections, and the existential and political boundaries of our world. Her research and work put special focus on issues that emerge from anthropocentric worldview of Western traditions. Are you ready to take a deep dive in those topics? Let's begin with Terike's gripping text on belonging.
That text came out of, it's a COVID text, and it came out of like intense isolation and loneliness. And I think that's actually something that is not always true, but I think is true often, is that art or creative effort grows out of a lack or absence or trauma or some disconnect or friction or something that kind of troubles you enough to make the effort of actually working on something, So instead of like intellectual curiosity, like the source of creativity is like there's something that needs attending, that you like mentally, emotionally need to attend to an issue because it's somehow burdening or troubling or hurting you in some way. And so absolutely that text came out of being very feeling like crushingly isolated during that time, and then thinking of like what is the need, like what kind of a connection do I need, what kinds of connections are nourishing. And so the text, just briefly, like the text goes through, kind of first introduces different ways of connecting to each other that are aiming to be like nonviolent or consensual, and kind of like weaves around this idea that a sense of feeling of belonging is when you have a consensual relationship where you can be yourself and you're accepted, and that there's no the things like punishment or demands or kind of conditions for belonging don't really like create this emotional sense of like wanting or feeling seen, feeling being present. And that one of the thoughts that had revealed itself to me like before I started writing was that we have all these art projects about and intellectual exercises on kind of more than human interactions that would be consensual. We're thinking of like ecosexuality or some kind of like kinship with a more than human world, while at the same time we have very little tools to be in consensual relations with each other as humans. Our societies are incredibly punitive and based on punishment and exclusion and demands, and and these are the models that we learn. And so how could we build consensual relations with other species if we don't even know how to do that with our close like family or loved ones, the human beings that are right there. So I was looking through different modes of how people have thought of transformative justice or restorative justice or nonviolent communication or different ways of thinking of consent in indigenous, scientific practices or Sami cultural practices, and then then going from there to think of like what would that mean in relationship to the modern human world? What kind of shift in our overall like relations with each other would that require? So it's kind of like paradoxical text in the sense that it's not based on, to some degree, of course, I'm sure it's based to some level of practice, like lifetime practice of trying to figure things out. But also it's written while I'm in the room alone, not in relations with anyone. So that's, and, the question of kind of national belonging. I think that's something that I've thought of, like more recently, is that I should maybe write a sequel, like on belonging to 2.0, to think about this question of patriotism and nationalism, that is very, very like problematic at the time, and how there is this sense of non-belonging that's created by all kinds of forces. Capitalism is like probably the driving force. I think white supremacy, patriarchy, this like individualism are part of the force of capitalism. So it's not external to those. Colonialism is like the force that is separating us from each other. And then the rise of white nationalism, for example, is like one manifestation of this need to find a way of belonging, but it's kind of perverted. Maybe, I don't know, like who am I to say it's perverted, but that there is something that's, it's not so simple that we on the, and I say we on the progressive left or in the post-humanities, we sometimes tend to romanticize. Maybe I shouldn't say we, like I romanticized this idea of belonging without thinking in that moment when I was writing the text, without thinking necessarily of the implications on the other side, which is like this need for belonging to a tribe, to a group, to, that also generate like exclusion and violence. And that we see like that's a huge problem at the moment. So like to think of like what are those political manifestations of this lack of belonging that people have, and the need to belong, and whether like how can we use this word belonging in a way that makes these important distinctions, of what do we mean in which context with that word. So that's kind of something, especially now with the question of Ukraine and everything that's happening in the Eastern Europe, and maybe in relationship to how maybe American left is viewing and has this different, like, and maybe like a problem with nationalism as it's like appearing now in the Eastern Europe. Is something that I think would be important to try to think. And I don't know how these two modes of belonging kind of, like how can you put them together in a meaningful way. But yeah, maybe just to conclude, I think like one reason for that text also is like, of course, I felt a intense feeling of not belonging, being like an expat, which I guess it's this kind of privileged non-belonging of still having everything, being belonging in whiteness, belonging in certain class position, belonging in many, many ways in the world. But then on some levels of emotional register or something like that, I don't feel that I belong to the US in that way. And that is also something I've thought of a lot, which is like, what does being a Finnish person, what does it mean to me? Because there is a sense of feeling of belonging, even belonging with the right-wing Finnish person, that there's something that we both belong into. And that's maybe a sense of language or a relationship to landscape or some kind of intergenerational way of being, cultural way of being that transcends political divisions. So like what is that? I don't really even know what is it.
But I wanted to continue on what you were saying before about nonviolent communication. as a tool to, or as a method to like a consensual co-being. I was thinking that this tool totally makes sense, but if we are going to communicate our boundaries and our needs, first we need to have access to what actually our needs are and what our boundaries are. And I think if we talk about like a traumatized people who are, after difficult experiences, and I think that I don't want to diagnose now everybody, but I think everybody has some smaller or bigger trauma. And I think there is often the synchronization of how we feel, what we talk, and what we do. They are not aligned, which is usually like this fragmentation. It's a symptom of trauma. Then I think this tool is not really inclusive for everybody, because not all people have always access, and I'm one of them, and I guess everybody a little bit is, to use this tool.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree that I think trauma is it's a creative force. Like there's enormous amount of creativity that comes from trauma-based behavior. I think a lot of art comes out of trauma. And I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. It's just like that's how it is. And I agree that probably most people have some kind of trauma. That if you think of trauma as like a medical sense of like an injury, we're all being bumped into things, and we're all like in different ways, injured, and there are traces of those injuries in us and we behave accordingly. I mean, I think there are ways to learn to reflect and see what is trauma reaction and what is reaction to what's happening now. I don't remember where I read someone wrote that, when you think or like reflect on your own reaction, you can think that the more hysterical, the more historical, So the more hysterical the reaction, the more you're immersed in it, and the more it overwhelms you, the more likely it is that it's historical, that it's something that's triggered by something that doesn't have to do with what's happening at the moment. And that's kind of helped me to somehow pay, or at least understand a little bit like what's what in different moments. I don't have an answer to that, but definitely like that's. But I have to say that I think like Rosenberg wrote in and worked in environments that were definitely like dense with trauma and trauma-based behavior. So I don't think it's exclusive of that. I think it's exactly more about being aware of what's happening and being aware of the needs and finding a way to articulate them, regardless of what is the original source. Yeah, I think it's a lifelong learning. But then maybe if you expand it to the more modern human world, of course, it's obvious that our like trauma is not a human only phenomenon. It's like that kind of trauma or intergenerational traces of different kinds of harm are all over with everything and in everything. And I'm sure there's a lot of ways in which we can't even perceive that as trauma. We see that as just as the way things are. I think it's Resmaa Menakem. He's saying basically that trauma in unacknowledged in a person looks like personality, and trauma unacknowledged in a family looks like I don't remember what was the word, but like trauma unacknowledged in a people looks like culture. And I think that's something that we can also expand to thinking of the more than human world, and that we see as culture or as natural, as something that's actually a trauma behavior.
Going a little bit farther from unbelonging, when I was looking at the documentation of your works, they often refer to like decay or like animal farms where, I don't know, antibiotics are used, and in general the interconnectedness. And I couldn't help, looking from my perspective to see that they are all loosely kind of, although not mentioning clearly, refer to also like a microbial work, right? Because if we think of decay and, I don't know, cooling body after death, the microbes already start their work. I mean, they are always there, but it's something which keeps being alive out there, right? Is it something you've been ever kind of reflecting on? Or is just me having my obsession with microbes and seeing them everywhere?
Well, I mean, it's very realist to see them everywhere because they are everywhere, like you say. I haven't thought of, like, I did one piece a long time ago, 2008, where I first encountered this question of microbes, and where the question of human microbiome was kind of just becoming, after the human genome project, the human microbiome project, or I don't know if it ever became a project like that, but was kind of starting to get some attention. And it's a very simple piece where I just pressed my face on a cultivation, like a surface, and then recorded what was growing out of it. And it was just a kind of a thought experiment on this idea that we are actually an ecosystem and not an individual, in the sense that we've learned to think of ourselves. And then also, like, that this community is not, its lifespan is not the same as my lifespan as a human being. So these issues that I think are very obvious now for anyone who's working in this field felt kind of like new, or like opening a new perspective. Since then, I haven't really thought of the question of microbes specifically, and I think because a lot of my own work has focused on mammals or like animals, so the question of animality and how that functions, then sometimes I find that when we then expand it from there to, microbes, it's easy to lose the focus of like some ethical urgencies of like hunting or factory farming, or and then if you just are like, okay, what about all these other relations? Like, can we manage these relations? And so it's more like maybe the question of microbes is posing a problem for me, in the sense of like, how do I articulate these ethical urgencies that I'm forefronting, which doesn't mean that the things you're working on aren't any less important. They're just like, it's a completely different set of questions. It's like the ethical questions are approached from a different angle. But how do I pose these questions about like animality or non-human animals in certain like conditions in capitalism? How do I make the differentiation that there is like certain set of ethics that are meaningful to discuss in relationship to these creatures, but actually bringing the bacteria into this conversation doesn't really help. It kind of like borders the ethical question if we try to address all relations like as like an equal, or not equal in the sense of better or worse, but equal in the sense that we could have like a blanket solution to everything. So maybe that's something and that was one of the reasons why I think this is a really interesting conversation, because I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are on this particular issue, because of course the relations with a scientist and a bacteria are very different than, say, like a producer producing meat on a pig farm or something like that. And the ethical questions are also different, or are they different? Like, should we have a blanket solution? So maybe I'm throwing the ball back to you.
Like the first thing which comes to my mind about the similarity, because I totally agree with you that putting, for example, mammals and microorganisms to one bucket is kind of blurring the urgency of the problems, which, for example, farming animals, let's say, is definitely having. So I totally agree with you regarding that. But I think that the similarity And what microbes could kind of confirm, those borders are much more blurred than we were kind of taught or told about. So if we think about like human and non-human mammals, let's say, I think that there's these borders are much more blurred than we could think of, and these divisions are just made. It's a bit like with races, right? Like they are made to serve certain like ideas and to kind of justify the exploitation. What you were mentioning about like this whole like the genome project, when kind of it got scientifically proved how microbes are present in human bodies, and that actually we are kind of mostly done with microbes, it also kind of questions, so what is human? Like where do I end and where do I start, right? Which I think that in the case of like this culture of individualism, it really questions that. So I think the similarity is exactly here, that on a kind of a mental level and how we construct reality in our heads, we are like these borders are all just made up, and they bring a lot of explanations to the current practices in the world and exploitation, but actually this is just all the constructs to justify this stuff. That's it.
Absolutely. And I think in both cases, when you say that these borders or boundaries exist only in order to justify exploitation, I think that's definitely true. And then there's also this fixation on identities and like a essential reading of things where we think in terms of this is this, so it belongs to this category, so this can be done to it. Where I think there's two problems with that. One is that things are not things. Things are processes. Things are dispersed into other things. It's like you say, it's impossible to say what's a human. It's just we constantly we evaporate into our surroundings. We change. We're cloud. We're not a thing. We're a cloud in movement. And everything's a cloud in movement. And so that first of like that misunderstanding of what's the quality of reality in the first place, that's one like misconception of what creatures are. But maybe if I can say something that I found really interesting in the beginning when you introduced your practice, and you said that you like a relationship to bacteria is like that bacteria don't have a personhood, which is kind of a good thing because they're not recognized as persons. So you can smuggle them in and put them in a pocket, and they're your companion, but they're not recognized as a person. And I think that's a super interesting point to make, which, when we're thinking of non-human legal personhood and who is recognized and who is seen and given that standing, in the face of law, that there's also something to be, some like surprising, benefit from not being recognized, from like not being recognized as an agent, not being put into these categories, and not being, not labeled into this and this and this. And actually now I remember what I was about to say about the other thing. So that the two kind of misconception is like that world would constitute of things first, and then the other is that as if like these moral categories would be developed by saying, oh, this is a chimpanzee, it's, characteristics are this and this, from that follows that we can't use them, but moral categories are not in actual reality. They're not produced like this. You have a chimpanzee that is similar to humans, and that can lead to its explicit exploitation, exactly because they're similar, or it can lead to it being protected because they're similar. So similarity or difference, the quality or the characteristics of any being is not ever in real life a justification for what can be done to it. It's like a different process. It's like the process of how something is rendered into exploitable is more, I think, a matter of violence. And I think a cage is a good example. It's like, it's not like you determine, okay, these are creatures that are, you can put in a cage because they're lower creatures, and then you put them in a cage. It's like, no, you put key creatures in a cage and they become lower creatures. So you put children in the cage and suddenly you can put these children in the cage because they're not quite human because they're in the cage. So it's these mechanisms of violence that actually produce these categories, these moral categories. It's not anything that is in the creatures themselves. So in that sense, like I'm also like very, like, I really love the idea that there is something subversive about not being a person, not being, you can't put me in that, you can't determine me in that way, or this phenomenon or this event in that way, that you escape, because there's something really like oppressive in thinking in terms of these categories, which is of course what we try to do, because we try to operate in a world that works through these categories, but ultimately, it's like it can't be the end solution. There has to be some other way of seeing what's happening, another way of relating to these processes than fixed identities and essences.
The last interview I recorded, we've been kind of with another person. We've been thinking about this. Our microbes, or the human microbiome, so the microbes which are within us, are they happy when we are happy? So can we somehow figure out that there's another species, or there's another entity shares the same goal with us? And I think that now when I heard you talking, I realized that this doesn't equal each other, because I think that for owners of the factory where, for example, I don't know, pigs are being kept, I think it makes owners pretty happy. They earn money on that and they are like, yeah, great. But those pigs, you can say, if you would go to the, I don't know, slaughterhouse, that they are not really happy. So it also, actually, it's very interesting, like that we can be very happy when other beings are very unhappy, basically, which kind of makes it even more impossible to realize, like maybe also the whole concept, or if bacteria is happy or not, is also totally wrong, right? Because it's human. But maybe here I would like to shift or like channel our conversation for another work I know you've been working on, and it's the Party of Others. Because when I was just like reading through the documentation of this process, and of course I would like you to tell us a bit more words about it, because who will better introduce it than you? But I wanted to brainstorm with you. Could we include some microbes in the Party of Others? But first, tell us a little bit more about that work, please.
I think, again, bacteria pose a question to the Party of Others, or like a challenge. Well, in a nutshell, Party of Others was a project I started in 2011 when there was the first real kind of landslide prior to the parliamentary elections that ended up with a real landslide of win of the right-wing populist True Finns. Or I guess they're now called the Finns, of the Finn party. I don't know. But that was like, the first time they actually got this level of attention and popularity in the Finnish landscape. And I think in European, like the rise of white nationalism was like just happening. So that was one reason. And that campaign was very much structured around what should we do with them, meaning the migrants, or the, anyone who is considered other from this, white nationalist mindset. So the language of othering was very present in that political discourse. Well, at the same time, I was working on issues or exhibitions that included works like working with CO2 sensors and environmental scientists, and thinking of like our relations to the modern human world as interconnected in different ways. and that we're like part of these nature cultures, and we're not separated and all that. And then at the same time, it felt like we're doing these prototypes in these gallery spaces. But then if I look out the window, and especially if I look into law, which is then the matrix that really like structures how we relate to each other, there is very much a distinction between human and nature, and animal and human. And so these distinctions are very hard lined, in the legal matrix of who can participate, and who is seen exactly, again, who is seen as a person who is visible. And so the Party of Others was an initiative that I started as a political party that would represent all of those who are not representable, all of those who are not persons, in the light of the current legislation. So mainly non-human world and nature and animals. That was the focus. But then expanding to the question of like all the other humans and other beings who are present but are not recognized as being part of the political community. So it was really kind of a project about the limits of the political community and how that political community is defined. And I interviewed a lot of people at the time, environmental ethicists, activists, lawyers, politicians, different kinds of people who had been, speaking on behalf of the other, in the more than human other, and asked how could we, if we had a political order where everybody would be represented, who would that everybody be? First of all, like who would be included in that, and then how would they be represented? How could we even, like, what kind of system of governance would we have? And they gave very different answers. Some were saying we should just retreat to, from the world and have like human only societies and then leave the others alone. And some would say we need to kind of go and live in small multispecies communities and delegate responsibilities across species. And we still would have to have like some kind of global, organization that would take care of things like climate change or things like this. So just experiments of like what a multispecies governance could look like. And that there was an exhibition and then a campaign where I campaigned for registering this political party in the official party register. And we got quite a lot of attention and people were quite interested in that, a lot of press. I think it was like an intriguing question, but this was at the time when the rights of nature was just like no one was talking about it. It just felt like this is not even a political question. This is absurd. Why would you talk about anything like this? So in 10 years or a little bit more than 10 years, a lot has changed. Like these questions have become completely mainstream and completely relevant in so many different ways. And also like they've actually been, there's a animal party in the European Parliament. There's been all these initiatives on non-human legal personhood from the perspective of natural entities such as rivers, usually coming from indigenous, places or countries with strong indigenous representation. And then on the other hand, you have campaigns for non-human legal personhood of animals that are very similar to humans, like orcas and elephants and chimpanzees. So it's like this idea of like personhood, legal personhood, and basic rights, and like expanding, decolonizing, our legal structure, or like expanding it to include more than humans is like very mainstream. I've tried to work on that a few times in different contexts, and I've found it that there's a paradox in the project that has kind of like held it stuck in a way, because the project was not. It's the kind of paradoxical project where I try to start a political party in good faith, to show how so many creatures are excluded, and by trying to open this thing up to including them, show how this premise of this whole system doesn't allow for them to be included, because the whole premise is based on a kind of anthropocentric notion of a legal order or governance that is exactly based on distinction from natural world, or like it's based on exclusion. So you can't have a fully inclusive political system if the principles of the political system are exclusion, So it never was meant to be like a fully functional political party that would, it was more like an intervention into politics. And this is the question that I've started now to think more of, like, okay, this question of rights has all kinds of like, I think all kinds of obstacles or problematics that I don't know, I don't know if they can be the end goal in some way. And I've also started to think that maybe like rights are not necessarily the best tool, like they're important tool, but we have human rights declaration. It's not a law, but it's a declaration, and at the same time there's more exploitation than ever. So I'm more interested in looking at the material situations where exploitation happens, and trying to think of like around those material practices, instead of thinking of these abstractions of who is entitled to rights, and not because it just feels like if you're entitled to rights, you can still be violently exploited, or if you're not entitled to rights, you can be, pampered and safeguarded. I'm thinking of like my dog who, is like, doesn't have rights, but is like safe, has dental health care and probably mental health care if he wanted to, and at the same time you have humans who are in a cage in a border. And, so these categories of who has rights, they don't necessarily like result in any justice in the material reality of the world. So I'm thinking of labor and material relations to each other at the moment more than I'm thinking of rights and personhood. But to your question of like, should bacteria have rights too? There's actually a very good article by a kind of animal rights theorist, scholar, posthumanist scholar, Zipporah Weisberg, where she's critiquing Donna Haraway. And I think the text is called "Should Bacteria Have Rights Too?" or something like that, where she's critiquing Donna Haraway and the posthumanist discourse that's sort of willing to throw concrete kind of, I don't know, animal rights out the window because of this theoretical position of like, like then every creature should have rights in a certain way. So you kind of can't anchor the question of rights into anything solid if you try to find this blanket solution where everybody should have some kind of equal standing. It's an interesting text. And what she's arguing in that text is like that instead of thinking of like in terms of posthumanism or posthuman, or like more than, maybe we should think of like left politics and think of a multispecies left politics that would be against this instrumentalization of all species, instead of thinking of, this through this human non-human rights framework.
I don't know the person you just mentioned and the text. Thank you for bringing it up. I'm gonna check it. I love the title already. I think that for me, what I see in your work, but also even in Ferment Radio, although as we agreed that it kind of tackles totally, different realm, and one shouldn't put the mammals and microbes to the same bucket. I think they are like thought exercises. I think we are living in the times of like hyper realism. When you watch TV or you go to the cinema, the pictures I see, they are like they are so hyper realistic that actually I am not able, with my human eye, I'm not able to see this amount of detail and the sand, the piece, the little grains of sand and the juiciness of colors. Like this is beyond of reality to me. How I perceive the reality, and I think that in the time of hyper realism, I feel like we need more kind of zooming out, zooming in, like looking at the things from different perspectives. Can we learn something through that metaphor? Can we learn something about like a life in general, while looking at this thing, because it's kind of still strange and unexplored, and some of the things can become a bit sharper and lesser from our prejudice, our presumptions. And I think this is why I am kind of exercising that muscle, which is very much kind of already intellectualized and thought through and back. And when we think about humans itself, and I don't know, even such important topics as, I don't know, cultures, genders, should we put one more there, and will it solve a problem? It's and I think when we open it up, and again, there's no personhood, what we are going to do with this, I can think better in that environment. And I think that's my personal motivation to operate in this micro scale.
Yes, I totally agree. And I know it made me think of, in one conversation, Eben Kirksey mentioned or talked about, in relationship to the question of exclusion and inclusion. And I hope I don't quote him wrong, but something along the lines of, like, instead of trying to get rid of exclusion altogether or find a fully inclusive system, to think of like what kinds of entanglements we want to have, what kinds of inclusions do we want to have, because we are, or what kinds of assemblages do we want to nurture, and that always includes excluding some variations, some possibilities, that we reject and don't want to have, on the expense of wanting to have some kinds of assemblages. And I think that's productive, to think that we can't have a world fully in harmony, because that's just not how the world exists. So yeah, that's definitely like really, really inspiring and really interesting. And I mean, bacteria or microorganisms are really, like, they rule the world. They're such powerful force that we actually, with my colleague Laura Gustafsson, with whom we've done work for 10 years, we started from the idea that we would make a museum for all the species that haven't been, whose view and perspective hasn't been kind of represented, and we called it the Museum of the History of Others, which in Finnish is Toisten historian museo. And then we at some point we even did a grant application for a museum of parasite, which in Finnish goes as Loisten museo, which was funny, and it's kind of like a silly joke. And we wanted to write like a world history from the perspective of microorganisms. Never got funding, so that went there. So hopefully someone does that. No, I'm sure now you would get funding for that after COVID. Yeah.
They were not interested in that perspective. How do you see it in your own work as an artist, and like juggling with those ideas, writing texts, making artworks to be exhibited? How these are connecting to the world? How do they have power, if any, to actually change anything on a, for example, systemic level, or the way that it really becomes a tangible change? Where does starts the action, and how it actually looks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess at this moment, my thinking is something like, there's nothing that doesn't have an effect on the world. That every gesture resonates and has ripple effects. Everything changes things, and so every movement is like, it has this ripple effect. So that's like one thing. Another thing, I've started to think of art in a way where I think of it less as the things we do, less as the outcomes in a way, and more as an orientation, and also as an orientation of certain kind of openness to the world, where we have to be emotionally also somehow available or open to things moving us and responding to them. But then maybe like mainly I think of art as a kind of very tangible part of our consciousness, one could say, where there are things we can't think inside our heads. We have to externalize them into language or into some visual forms or into some writing or texts or images or something. And that's always been the case. And I think that's actually not just a human quality. It's like all kinds of forms of consciousness need to externalize themselves into some kind of material outcome so that we can reflect on them. It's almost like we can't do the thinking only in our heads. We need something to put that thinking into so that we can actually comprehend and get somewhere. And then of course the things that we externalize, that we kind of push out of our heads, then have an impact in the world and have an impact into what it's this ongoing process where we are materially engaged in thinking. That thinking, and not in the sense of like just this like mind, but just like consciousness is this evolving process of that the evolution of consciousness is like a material process. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. And that in some way art is a very important driver or way of manifestation of that evolution of consciousness, one might say, that then we see as cultures or we see as movements or whatever. But basically you can't put a cap on it. You can't say, oh, art's not good, let's not fund art, so art would somehow stop. It doesn't stop. We've seen it. It just keeps coming. You can put a person in a cave somewhere and it just keeps coming, because it's like you can't chop a head off of a person and then be like, well, it's better off without. It's a functional part of how we exist in the world. So I'm not so, so that's why I'm not so worried about like what's good art and what's bad art, or should art be, or what kind of art should be. Like those are the kind of practical questions that, yeah, of course, when you have to deal with funding of art or something like that, then you have to think of like how to manage that. But art keeps happening and it keeps being this important force in the evolution of consciousness. And so it matters more, what do we focus our attention on? Like that's actually the only thing that matters, because that's where we direct the flow of consciousness into something that can generate something that's not self-destructive. So in that sense, I feel like, and maybe this is an elitist position, which is like you can be, away from the world and still like do this thing where you're focusing you don't have to be politically active. I'm not saying that either. We have to be engaged with the world in many different ways and try to be active in whatever arenas we have. But I would never say that art doesn't have power to change things if art is not, somewhere with a banner, with like a statement. Because in some way, I think art is a life transforming force. It's a manifestation of this ongoing force of like how we kind of go in the world and think it anew, think it to become something else. And yeah, so I think like these questions about the modern human world or environmental issues or whatever, it's like the more people focus their attention on this, like it's like more like a beam of light. If we focus our consciousness into these things, then we start producing things that again change our way of being, change our our practices. That it's more like, I don't care if I'm talking with my students, I don't care if the art is good or bad, or if someone buys them, or like I don't like, that's not so relevant. What's relevant is that they focus their beam of their attention, the beam of their consciousness, into something that is deeply meaningful for them and also is not destructive to the world. And that's I think that's the ethical imperative, I think, for an artist to do. yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. Might change. And again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be politically active. But I could imagine having a very apolitical practice, very meditative in a way, I do have very contemplative practice that's very kind of quiet and private. But in some other ways, I try to be politically aware or active. And I don't think they have to necessarily go together in order for that art to have some kind of impact in the. It's this idea that as if consciousness would be isolated in like it's not. We're part of this wave of that thing that's happening that we are just part of, and that's we're little droplets in this wave. The question of animality is not a killing per se. It's that when we have a category of the animal, it creates a realm of where killing with impunity becomes possible. So it takes away killing as transgression. It takes away all the ethical implications of like killing. It's just like, okay, killing is just a technicality, and I see animality as a conceptual area as like, it's like the sin, the crime of animality is not the violence itself. Violence is part of life, but it's in creating this category where we clean ourselves from any crime, where when like we can just kill, and we don't have to go and compensate it in any way. We're not, we don't have to deal with it in any way. It's practicality. And so that's kind of where I think our Western culture is really, really like fucked up, because it's like everything's founded on this idea that there are these areas of violence with impunity, and animality is like what really kind of holds together this idea that there is this. It's like that's the way in which these categories are upheld, is that we have animals and you can do anything to animals, and so you can put anyone in that category, and then you can do anything to them, whether they're human or non-human or whatnot. So getting rid of this category, I think, is essential. It doesn't mean that we could get rid of killing, and I think that's a big difference. It means that we can't get rid of predation. Like maybe coming back to your bacteria happy, I'm sure some would be very happy if you died, and but you probably wouldn't be. And vice versa, so this idea that there would be a harmony where everybody would be happy and nobody ever died or killed each other, that's not, actually what it's not like a perverse idea of life. So it's not predation. Predation is a natural part of life, but I think there's a difference in understanding that that we live with this violence, that life requires this violence, and that it is a transgression, that there's no way out of it, that we kill, it's a crime, we still have to do it, we have to somehow make up for it, we have to have different rituals to make up for it, that there's no escaping that burden of that ethical violation, that ethical violation is something that we have to, and yeah, I think this is actually something that I hear from my friends who are like Sami, or, who are living in a different cosmology, different kind of relationship to nature. Is not that you would get rid of any predation or any killing. It's just you get rid of this idea that there would be killing that would not be a not be a violation, or not be a violence. And maybe, yeah, that's just something that I wanted to say, maybe in relationship to the microbial world also, is that we live in this, we do live in this very complex world where there's no harmony that's great for everyone.
Art can be a tool for researching things that have not been imagined yet. Thank you, Terike, for your thought-provoking work and for sharing your valuable insights here on Ferment Radio. I would like to end this episode with a quote from Ed Yong's book, "I contain multitudes, the microbes within us and a grander view of life." It has something to do with belonging as well. When Orson Welles said, "We are born alone, we live alone, we die alone," he was mistaken. Even when we are alone, we are never alone. We exist in symbiosis, a wonderful term that refers to different organisms living together. Some animals are colonized by microbes while they are still unfertilized eggs. Others pick up their first partners at the moment of birth. We then proceed through our lives in their presence. When we eat, so do they. When we travel, they come along. When we die, they consume us. Every one of us is a zoo in our own right, a colony enclosed within a single body, a multispecies collective, an entire world. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is produced by Super Eclectic and is brought to you by Arts Promotion Center Finland, Culture of Cultures, and the Center of the Social Study of Microbes. This particular episode was recorded during a residency at the BioArt Society Finland. Thank you very much for the support, and most of all, thank you all for listening. Keep fermenting and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.